We're so delighted to have Maestro William Boughton with us, and we appreciate his invitation to us to perform this epic piece. It's a piece that I know that many of you have done in the past, and everybody who, when we say that we're doing this, the Elgar, they just sigh with joy. And I've seen that so many times with all of you. Now, I'm learning the piece myself. I knew it just a bit, but not nearly enough. And now I'm really very happy to be engaged in the study of it along with you. Maestro Boughton is very well known throughout the Western world in his conducting and in orchestras he's established and recordings, and also New Haven Symphony on the map even more with additional recordings, which have not taken place for quite some time. So thank you, sir. The evening is yours. Welcome. Thank you.
Good evening. I thought I might just actually be speaking to Rick this evening, looking at the weather out of the window. So thank you for coming. I thought I would start with a little bit of background about Elgar. If you picture the country of the United Kingdom, that excludes Ireland, which is its own island. You have Scotland in the north, you have Wales over in the west, and then the main body of England. And in the Midlands is where Elgar came from, and Cardinal Newman. Elgar was born in a small village called Broadheath, which was within earshot of the city of Worcester. The cathedral in Worcester became extremely important to him. He was brought up in a tiny, tiny cottage, and his father ran a music shop in Worcester. The music shop is important because that was Elgar's education. A country boy, literally a country bumpkin. He gained all of his knowledge from musical material within that shop. He played a number of instruments and wanted to become a violinist, but he was shunned by the establishment both as a violinist and as a composer. Indeed, the composers that taught at Cambridge and the Royal Academy, the Royal College of Music, never thought Elgar to be a proper composer because he didn't have the right education. He was self-taught. And thank God he was, because he broke the mold. I don't know if any of you know of people like Stanford, who was the composer of a similar period, and Parry. They were more traditionalists. They composed in the style of Europeans. But so did Elgar. His great influences from the music shop of his father were Brahms, Schumann, and Wagner. He was a great Wagnerian. Of course, he went on to become the most well-known composer in England and captured the times, the Edwardian times of Downton Abbey. So if you think of that period, you think of the pomp and circumstance and the world of Elgar. But he had a huge chip on his shoulder because he did come from a tiny village. But more than that, he was a Roman Catholic. And to be accepted in England with the Protestants, and this work being extremely Roman Catholic, he had a very difficult time. So throughout his life he struggled. He was given all sorts of accolades. Do you know the famous story of him at Yale? He was offered in 1905, along with Taft and a number of other well-known people, an honorary doctorate at Yale. And he stood on the stage at Wolsey Hall, and at the end of the ceremony, Horatio Parker, who was the first conductor of the New Haven Symphony Orchestra and in charge of the composition department at Yale, played Pomp and Circumstance No. 1. with the New Haven Symphony Orchestra. You all know how Pomp and Circumstance goes?
Yes.
And that's where the tradition started, in Wolsey Hall. So the association with Elgar is very important. His great friend at Yale was a man called Sanford. Not Stanford, but Sanford. And Sanford was probably the finest pianist that America has ever produced. But he never performed in public. Paderewski, Rubinstein, not Archer Rubinstein, but his predecessor, who was the principal and composition teacher at the Moscow Conservatory, all admired him, but he suffered from terrible nerves. He was a $1 a year professor, and he was the instigator of getting Elgar the honorary doctorate at Yale. Cardinal Newman's home was the Birmingham Oratory. So we come to the dream of Gerontius. Cardinal Newman's poem tells of the journey of a man's soul after death. Gerontius may be translated roughly as old man. Elgar was given a copy of the poem in 1889 as a wedding present. But while he undoubtedly toyed with the idea of setting it to music intermittently over the intervening period, the decision to do so for the 1900 Birmingham Festival appears to have been taken somewhat at the last minute. His earlier ideas for the festival describe a work which eventually emerged as his oratorio, The Apostles. The first performance was not a success. Neither W.C. Stockley, the chorus master, nor the great maestro Hans Richter had grasped the complexity of the work and allowed insufficient time for the rehearsals. But the more perceptive members of the audience recognized the work's merit. These included Julius Butz, director of the Lower Rhine Festival, who staged the work in Dusseldorf in 1901. The performance was played to a packed audience of 2,500 people and was an unqualified success, and was followed in March 1903 by further acclaimed performances on successive nights. The first by the great Halley Orchestra under Richter in Manchester, and the second in a place called Hanley with Elgar himself conducting. Today, the work is undoubtedly the most popular of all Elgar's choral works, and indeed among the most frequently performed of all his works, except in this country. Surely no one can remain unmoved by the priest's invocation to Gerontius as part 1 ends. Go forth, proficere anima Christiana, nor in part 2 by the chorus of Praise to the Holiest, the words of which were also taken to form the well-known hymn. But these excerpts should not be allowed to overshadow much other beautiful writing in the piece. And while early commentators may have been wary of the work's essentially Catholic stance, the composer, as I just mentioned, Charles Villiers Stanford, is reported to have said, the work stank of incense. Most now are struck by the more dramatic intensity and integrity of the subject. The work continues to be performed regularly throughout Britain. The 3rd of October 2000 saw the centenary of the work's first performance, leading to much increased interest in the work. In recognition of this interest, and as a service both to the performers and to the visitors to this cathedral, or cathedrals, we have expanded our coverage of the work. Elgar lived in a small town of Malvern, I've just told you about, and it's famous for its water. The Queen actually only drinks Malvern water, and wherever she travels in the world, she has to take Malvern water with her. Cardinal Newman, as I've just said, wrote The Dream of Gerontius, and his home was the Birmingham Oratory. Elgar sought out his friend Father Richard Bellasis for help in abridging the poem. Gerontius in the poem is an old man who dreams of his death and afterlife. Elgar wrote to his great friend and publisher, "I imagine Gerontius to be a man like us, not a priest or a saint, but a sinner, a repentant one, of course, but still no end of a worldly man in his life, and now brought to book." Newman's poem consists of 912 lines in the first part, divided into 7 sections. Elgar kept most of the 170 lines in part 1. The solo parts of Dream of Gerontius are Gerontius, a tenor, the priest in part 1 and Angel of Agony in part 2 are sung by the bass baritone, and the angel is sung by a mezzo-soprano. The role of Gerontius is extremely demanding. In part 1, he is a dying man, and in part 2, he is, of course, the soul and his journey to meet his maker. Similarly, the bass baritone requires a change of approach between that of the priest in part 1 and the angel of agony in part 2. The role of the angel is more clearly defined, except, have any of you read Newman's poem? In Newman's poem, he was a man. The choral writing is dense, demanding, and encompassing a huge range of technical and musical demands. One moment ethereal, the next threatening and frightening. Elgar's orchestration is huge. 3 each of flutes, 1 doubling piccolo, oboes with cor anglais, clarinets with bass clarinet, bassoon and contrabassoon. 4 horns, 3 trumpets, 3 trombone, tuba, percussion, 2 harps, organ and strings. Almost 100 musicians in the orchestra, so you better be in good voice. This epic work is unique for a number of reasons. It's Roman Catholic content, and it is the only oratorio that employed Wagnerian principles. In other words, its use of leitmotifs that hold the whole work together.